1 Corinthians 7, okay? 1 Corinthians 7. This every Tuesday we have every other Tuesday we have like an all staff meeting, and then we have also pastoral staff meeting where pastors meet together. And so this past Tuesday, Jeff was going to be late. It was Nolan, myself, and Jeff, and Jeff was going to be a little bit late. And so Nolan and I met for a little while, and Jeff came in probably about, it must have been maybe an hour later. He had some other things that were going on. And Jeff comes in and he goes, "Hey, Tom," he goes, "You know your car's on?" I'm like, He said, "No, I'm serious. Your car's on." And I said, I don't think so. I don't think my car's on. So I got up from the chair there and went outside. And sure enough, my car had been running for an hour plus, just sitting out there running. And I thought to myself, is this what it's like to get old? Is this what it's like to get old? How many more problems am I going to have in my life? And I at that point, I was like, I have never done that before, to my knowledge at least. And I started thinking to myself, I mean, what was I thinking? That I just got out of the car, because I knew when I got out of the car that I tried to lock the car and the car didn't lock. And I thought, well, I was like, well, who cares? We're just here at the church. And so I just walked in, and I really was like, man, something is wrong. There's something not right in the head when you start things that you've always known to do or going through the routine that you should do, and you for some reason don't do them, or you forget to do them, or you forget all this stuff. It really makes you rethink this age thing, this maturity thing. Is getting older really better, or is it worse because you start forgetting things and you start having more problems with your hurting, your body, all this kind of stuff, your mind? And it just got me to think, wow, some people say the older years are just the better years. And I'm like, I'm not sure. I think they're lying. I think those people are lying. And what we see here in this letter that Paul's been writing to the church at Corinth is they have been a church for a couple years when he writes to them. And over that time, some of the problems, they really, I would say they had forgotten a lot about what Paul invested into them when he first came to the city of Corinth around AD 51. Over the course of a couple years, it seems like their maturity, the problems that entered into the church were very difficult in nature with such a rapid nature that Paul felt it necessary to write this letter to say, hey, you guys have some problems, and we need to address these problems. In the first 4 chapters of this letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he wrote about unity problems. There was division in the church amongst its members, and they were aligned. What it seems like Paul's writing about is that they were aligned behind certain individuals. So they would say, I follow this person, I follow that person, I follow this person, and nobody got along. There wasn't this unity. And then over the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about something that's super awkward for all of us to talk about, but I think it's extremely important to talk about these things because the world is talking about these things, and the church, just because it's awkward, shouldn't stay away. And Paul addresses, and again, this letter was written almost 2,000 years ago, and many of these things are still relevant, but he addresses some sexual problems in the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we looked at a very specific situation where there was an incestuous relationship that Paul called out the church at Corinth and said, hey, you guys need to hold this person accountable by getting him out of the church. You shouldn't say that we're a loving, accepting, a tolerant church, and so we're just letting this person that's continuing in their sin stay in the church. So he encouraged them to let this man go out from the church, to discipline him, let him go out of the church, and with the hope that he would repent and be restored. And then last week, Jeff talked to us through 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And what we found there is that there are consequences for immorality. And Paul addressed those very heavily. He came to verse 17 of chapter 6. He says, but he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Now, all sin is an offense to God. It doesn't matter what it is, but there is something about sexual sin that brings along with it consequences that are a lot different from many other sins. Now, I do apologize if you're a guest, if this is your first time here, or maybe you grew up in church, you walked away from church, and now this is your first Sunday back to church. You haven't been to church in a long time. You're gonna feel super awkward about this because maybe, especially if you grew up in like youth ministry and they used to talk about sex a lot, you're gonna feel like you're right back in that today. So I do apologize to any guests that are here. But I do wanna give a word of warning. First of all, I wanna say that typically the elementary, they're covering like the heat is on in here today. And then we're gonna talk about some things that are gonna make you sweat a little bit and make you feel awkward, and it's gonna make you feel like you're back in middle school again, that people are talking to you about this for the first time. But I feel like these things are extremely necessary. So I'm just giving you a heads up that if you do have students in here, well, not students, I think you're okay to hear this, but if you have real young kids, it may be something that we'll bow our heads and close our eyes. You can just exit them out of here. But some of these things will be a little bit awkward to talk about. The reason that we're talking about these things is because when Paul wrote about these sexual problems that the church of Corinth had, now the focus is going to slightly change just a little bit. Paul is now going to address some questions the Corinthian church had written to him. The first 6 chapters we see, these are things that had been reported to him. We see the house of Chloe was the tattletale, had told Paul all these things are going on. And the first six chapters, he addressed these with the church of Corinth. And now when you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, it says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. It's like, for instance, if you wrote me an email, or Jeff or Nolan or somebody on our staff, you wrote an email and you said, listen, I have some questions, and then we responded back to those questions. This is what's happening now. Now the church of Corinth is taking its turn. And in 1 Corinthians 6, so Paul writes about the dangers of sexuality outside of marriage. Now Paul's going to instruct them concerning sexuality within marriage. There may have been some disagreement among the Corinthians whether it was better to be married or to remain single. And there may even have been a faction amongst the church or a teaching amongst the church that said it was more spiritual to remain single or celibate, which caused them to write what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now, regarding the questions you asked in the letter, yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. Now, Paul is talking specifically about sexual sin here. This chapter really gives us some instructions for the most basic teachings about marriage, about being single, about being widowed, and even within the bounds of marriage and remarriage and divorce. We're going to talk about a lot of different things today. And I think why this is important is because as a people that were created in God's image, we want to make sure that we're looking at a sexual relationship, a marriage relationship, if we choose singleness for our lives, or if we're divorced or widowed. How does this look? How do we live out our faith? What are the instructions that are given to us? Well, first of all, we're really just going to look at 2 main points today. We're going to look at instructions for marriage in verses 1 through 24 of chapter 7. And then we're going to look at some instructions for the unmarried or the singles and the widows in verses 25 through 40. We don't have time in our worship service this morning to go through all 40 verses. And if you're following along with our Bible reading plan, this would be great for you to spend a little bit more time, to go a little bit slower through this. And if you are following our chapter reading plan, you'll go through 1 Corinthians chapter 7. You'll read it multiple times over the course of the several months that you're doing this. So first of all, Paul talks about instructions for marriage. Remember, they had asked these questions, and Paul was now addressing these things. We're going to stay, and this is just going to let you know where we're headed, because you wish that Paul would have kind of eased into this, but he doesn't. So let's start in verse 3. I'm going to read from the NLT today. I know typically we read from the ESV, so if you're following along in a Bible app on your phone or your tablet or something, flip over to the NLT. Here's what it says, verse 3. The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. Verse 5. Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So first of all, instructions for marriage, Paul just dives right into it, is that sexual needs should be met within a marriage relationship. I don't want you to misinterpret what we're saying here. We've talked, hopefully over the last couple weeks, we've set a foundation for what a marriage relationship is. So I don't want, especially if like this is your first week or you've been gone for a couple weeks and you're just coming back into this thinking that, oh, a marriage relationship is the most important thing is a sexual aspect of that. And I want to say that we've said this repeatedly, but it is a part of marriage. It doesn't make up the whole. But as we arrive at this point, Paul is very clear with them. If you are in a marriage relationship, the husband is responsible to fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. There in verse 5, he talks about not depriving each other of sexual relationships unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time. NLT just kind of spells it out, and it just says what it is. Okay, so everybody look at me here. It's okay. Like if your head starts to, you start to look down, it's okay. We can look each other in the eye. We're adults. Most of us are adults in here. If you're a student in here and you're sitting by your parents, I apologize in advance. It's super awkward. But you got here because your parents, they had sex. So let's just talk about this. Now, a sexual relationship is a necessary part of any marriage relationship. And let me be clear here. A sexual relationship within a marriage does change seasonally. And I'm not talking about winter, spring, all that kind of stuff. But I'm just saying that there are changes and ebbs and flows to a sexual relationship in a marriage. Anybody getting uncomfortable yet? You guys okay? Need to turn on the air conditioner here. It is important that within a marriage, that a regular sexual relationship should be normal. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, well, how often? What do you mean by normal? Once a week, twice a week, once a month? What? Birthdays, holidays, that kind of stuff. We're not talking about frequency here. That is for you in a relationship to decide. But within a marriage, a regular sexual relationship should be normal. And failure to maintain a sexual relationship within marriage, as Paul is very clear, invites temptation. It does. God created us, as we said when we jumped into this conversation in chapter 5, is that God made sex a part of marriage. And if you're married in here and you are not having a regular sexual relationship, it's a conversation that you as a couple need to have. And I know that our tendency is like, oh, well, it's weird to talk about that. Well, let me just say this. It's weird to not talk about it. Because as God created us as sexual beings, and if that sexual relationship is not taking place, then in our minds, if God created us to make that a part of our relationship, we are thinking through those things. And what better way to process those things than processing those with the person that you on this earth love the most? We should, there's so much talk about make America great again. Let's make sex great again by talking about it in the relationship. And sometimes those conversations are not easy to have, are they? Right? If you've been married more than like maybe a month or so, or those conversations aren't easy to have. But I think that we should make that more common to have those conversations with our spouse. It should not be characteristic of your marriage relationship that there is no sexual relationship happening within the marriage. That should not be the norm. So just because we're here and we don't maybe often get a lot of opportunities to talk about this in depth, along with this, maybe some of you think, okay, within the realm of a marriage, what is acceptable bedroom behavior? Now, in my understanding of Scripture, nothing is off limits in the bedroom as long as each other is in agreement and comfortable with it. But let me caution you to this. I want to caution you to where you get your ideas of what happens in your own bedroom. You shouldn't be looking at porn. We addressed this a couple weeks ago. You should not be watching sexually explicit material or researching sexual ideas to see what you should be practicing in your marriage relationship. If you're doing that, it's a sin. That is only meant to take place within a marriage. And regardless of whether that is an action that's on the outward or something that you're looking and filling your mind with, we should not get our ideas for sex from pornography. So how do you determine in the bedroom what is okay? Well, as a couple, as two human beings that are created in the image of God, use your mind. Talk about it. Explore each other's likes and dislikes. Now, you might say, okay, let's move on from this, but again, let's talk about these things because the world's talking about this, so the church needs to talk about this. And I apologize because I know what we're about to kind of descend into for just a minute or two here, for some of you is extremely awkward. Some of it is a generational thing. You grew up in a generation. No, first of all, nobody talked about sex, and then what we're going to talk about now, nobody ever talked about this. But I think it's important that we address this. Some people associate outside of marriage, but because we've said that sex should only take place within a marriage relationship, the question may come along, how about self-pleasure? And I am not going to spend a lot of time here because, again, I know it's uncomfortable. But I do want to talk about this briefly and honestly. The Bible never mentions the topic, so it's difficult for me to say that the Bible says that self-pleasure is a sin. But in my heart, I believe that self-pleasure is brought about through lustful thoughts, even if it does not involve looking at pornographic images. The imagination or your imagination is a powerful thing. The problem is really not an issue of self-pleasure, but the issue is lust. And Jesus was very clear that lust in the heart is a sin. And it brings us back to the simplistic teaching that a sexual relationship is meant to be within the bounds of a marriage relationship between a man, a male, and a female for a lifetime. At the most basic of this, sex is meant only to be within that marriage bounds. So if you're practicing a sexual relationship out of marriage, or even if you're in a marriage, but there are lustful things that are, you're looking at things or you're doing things that you should not, that is not within the bounds of a marriage relationship, then you need to strongly examine God's teaching about what is meant. And I know there's pushback on this because it's an uncomfortable topic. But I don't care if you watch TV, if you read the news, it doesn't matter. Like, it's all over. Everybody else is talking about these subjects. Everybody else is talking about it. And for the church to just simply ignore it and think it doesn't happen, or if you're a parent in here and you think that your kids are just so naive and they have no idea what this is, listen, if they're around any other individual, they're hearing about it. Oh, my kids go to Christian school. So did I. Where do you think I learned about all that stuff? In the Christian school. Whatever's happening in the public school is happening in the Christian. Oh, my kids are homeschooled. Listen, your kids will learn. You cannot isolate them or insulate them enough that they will never hear about these things. They'll hear about it. And I would rather that they hear it from you first. And then I appreciate the fact that the church, it's not our church, but I hope every church addresses some of these things. So sexual needs should be met within a marriage relationship. All right, let's move on. And all God's people said, amen. Let's drop down to verse 12. I realize we're skipping some verses here, but again, there's 40 verses. We're not going to be able to cover everything. The second instruction for marriage is that if a believer and an unbeliever are married, they should stay married. And this might be relevant to some, I am certain that there are individuals in this room where you are a believer that is married to an unbeliever. And believe it or not, there's throughout my time, and I'm sure Jeff could say this, and maybe not Nolan. Nolan, is a little bit younger, but we've dealt with a lot of situations and circumstances through the years where a believer is married to an unbeliever, and it causes some problems within the marriage. It can. I'm not saying that it always does, but there are some issues when a person is a believer. Their worldview or the way that they conduct their life is distinct from the way sometimes that a life of an unbeliever is conducted. So Paul addresses this beginning in verse 12. He says, now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. If a fellow believer has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to continue living with him, he must not leave her. Verse 13. And if a believing woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. And the simplistic argument is this, is that there may have been people in the church at Corinth that were like, hey, I'm married to somebody that's outside the faith, so I should just go ahead and divorce them. Paul's like, no. If you're married, and there's a lot of teaching, and again, I wish we had a lot of time to walk into the teaching, but there's a lot of influence that can happen within a marriage when there is a believer and unbeliever. Now, can I back up from that? If you're still single and you're looking to, mingle, can my challenge be to you that you would never date somebody who did not share your faith? So if you're single now, it doesn't matter if you're just in middle school or going to high school. When you start walking out into that dating realm, you should always look for someone that shares the same passion for faith that you have. It honestly will prevent a lot of heartache in the future. But if a believer and unbeliever are married, they should stay married. But then in verse 15, we start to get into a little bit of complications here. It says, but if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insists on leaving, Paul says, let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. If you have a believer and unbeliever who are married, and within the marriage, if the unbelieving spouse says, I'm out of here, they want to leave or depart or desert the marriage. Divorce is never God's first choice. Now, I realize we have people in here that are divorced. I know we have probably almost every representation of family makeup here at all, just in this room or online. But there are some times in a relationship when there's so much conflict, maybe regarding a believing spouse, and the values and the way that they live their life is in such contrast to the unbelieving that the unbelieving just wants to walk away. And it brings me to the question, what can or should break the marriage bond? And I will say that divorce is never the first option. It's never God's plan. But I do want to talk about a couple things that we would say are exceptions. Exceptions not because God was like, yes, this is the first thing I want or I desire, but there are exceptions. And the first thing we already addressed, when an unbelieving spouse departs. Now, can I throw something in here? And the Bible doesn't address this, but it's something, again, we're just talking about because it's a reality in the society that we live in. What about an abusive marriage? That's complicated, isn't it? And the Bible doesn't address that as an exception for divorce. And it's complicated because I personally think if anybody's in an abusive, dangerous, unsafe relationship, they should not stay in that home. And I love what Kevin DeYoung said, and he addressed this, an abusive marriage, and he would really put that under when an unbelieving spouse departs. He says, if a guy is strung out on drugs, gambling all their worldly possessions, repeatedly beating his wife, might that count as desertion at some point? I mean, honestly, somebody that continues an abusive behavior, could they even be a genuine believer if they would continue in those things without repentance? The second exception, when the marriage bond can be broken, this is an obvious one, but in Romans chapter 7, verse 2, it says, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband when he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. And this is just simple, it's just easy. It's easy to say, it's difficult for any of you who have gone through this before. But the marriage bond is broken when a spouse passes away. And then third, and I will say not everybody agrees on this one. And in fact, I used to personally take a different position than I have now concerning the third. But when can a marriage bond be broken? First of all, when an unbelieving spouse departs, when a spouse dies, and then third, when adultery has taken place. Matthew chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. These are the words of Jesus. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Jesus is saying here, it was never my intention or plan that anybody ever divorce. It was never set up from the beginning that there should be divorce that takes place. Verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And these are strong words here, okay? Marriage is a serious commitment that you make. And when you jump out of a marriage, if you jump out just because like, hey, I just don't like this person anymore, they get on my nerves, so it'd be better just to not be married to that person, then there are some strong words. And I believe, this is my opinion, and I think there would be people that would disagree, good people that would disagree. But I believe that when divorce is permitted, that remarriage is also permitted. Although both divorce and remarriage should be approached with extreme caution. I think that a person, when there are marital issues in their life, one of the first things that you do, I mean, everybody has marital problems. Every single person in this room, if you're married, you have issues, you have things that you fight through. That's as human beings, I mean, God, that's part of the curse, that there would be this struggle between husband and wife. But you know, as a couple, when you get to a place where that struggle that you're having is just not resolving itself. And my challenge and encouragement to you is before you start talking about, hey, we're just getting a divorce, you should always seek counsel. And I think that counsel, it doesn't have to start here at church, but I think it's great. Like if you're struggling in your marriage, I mean, over 26 years of being a pastor, I've talked to a lot of people that have had marital struggles. I look back at my own marriage, and there have been seasons of just, Leah's in second service, she'll be in second service, so I won't say this then. We've had some hard years of marriage. I'm not just talking about a day or two or a week or a month. We've had times where it's been a couple years where we've struggled through things. Now, after being married for 27 years, I look back and I'm thankful that during those times that we didn't throw in the towel. But what I'm saying is that if you're here and you're struggling in your marriage, it's always best to seek counsel. Now, I'm not saying that this is 100% true, but I think, and Jeff can correct me if he thinks a little bit differently about this. But for as long as you allow yourself to continue in deep-seated problems in your marriage, it's probably going to take you that long to dig yourself out. And unfortunately, a lot of people come in for counsel when they're a decade into their marital problems that has been building, and it just comes to a point where like, okay, we're going to get divorced now, and there's been 10 years. It is so much easier that when you see that there are things that we're struggling through, that we're just not able to push through, that we get outside godly counsel and we work through it. And I am absolutely convinced, and if both people in a marriage, regardless of the problems that they are having, if both people are willing to work through it, I believe any problem can be worked through. Humanly speaking, no. But through the power of the Holy Spirit, I believe that God can give us the power to overcome any problem that we're going through. If you're here today and your marriage is struggling right now, there is no better time to get counsel than right now. Because the longer that you wait, the harder it gets. And here's one of the unfortunate things that we see very often. And again, I know I keep pointing out Jeff here, but we've dealt with this for the longest time. Sometimes you'll have a spouse that will come in and they'll be like, our marriage is going through difficulty. And my first reaction is always like, okay, can we get all three of us in the room to talk. Well, they don't want to talk. And then sometimes the other person will just be like, I'm giving up. And then the other person will want to work on things. You got to get both people on the same page. And I would say that when you see these issues or problems in your marriage, don't wait to get counsel. Don't wait. Somebody say, well, like, I'm far into this. Like in our marriage, we've been struggling for a long time. Like what do we do? It's never too late. But it's just going to take a lot more work from you and the Spirit in your life the longer you allow problems to go on. So let's talk about the second set of instructions. In verses 25 through 40. And this is instructions for the unmarried and widows. Look at verse 28. It says, but if you do get married, it is not a sin. Again, probably Paul was combating people that said, well, it's more spiritual if you stay single. He says, if you do get married, it's not a sin. And if a woman gets married, it is not a sin. However, those who get married at this time will have troubles, and I am trying to spare you those problems. First of all, I want to say this. There are advantages for those who choose to remain single. Now, please don't misunderstand me. But I think everybody that's married in here, you would agree that marriage brings its own unique struggles. And when you choose, maybe you have the gift of singleness, meaning that Paul talks about it. Paul himself was single, but some people think that he was married at one time. His wife died. We don't know. But he realized that there are unique pressures of marriage. For anybody in here that is single, there might be people in here that you're single and you have no desire to get married. And you might get pressure from people saying, that's so weird, when are you getting married and all this kind of stuff. Singleness can be a gift. Because marriage can involve conflicts, demands, difficulties, adjustments that singleness does not, because it presses two fallen people into an intimate life that leads to inevitable trouble. The troubles of singleness may be exceeded by the conflicts of marriage. So there's this heart within you that says, I never want to get married. That's not weird. It may be the way that God has gifted you. It may be a way to avoid the unique pressures of marriage. But Paul also comments on something that's extremely interesting. Look at verse 32. He says, I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking how to please him. But a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. Now, he wasn't saying that in a derogatory way, so don't misunderstand what he's saying. But he's saying part of the gift of singleness is that there's no divided loyalty. And if you're single here and that desire to focus your attention on what God has for you, you realize that there are a lot more things that are afforded to you as far as your loyalty and your time and your effort. So please don't misunderstand me. Singleness is not for everybody, but there are some people that God calls to singleness. And I think it should be, let's remove this from our language. When we meet somebody and maybe you're in your 50s like me and you meet somebody in their 20s and they're not married yet, don't say, hey, are you going to get married? Because, it's not fair, right? Because not everybody has to get married. Not everybody wants to get married. So it's important that we understand that when a person chooses to remain single, they avoid the unique pressures of marriage and they avoid this divided loyalty. They can focus on God's work for them. And then the last, verses 39 and 40, we see some instructions for the widows. Verse 39 says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. We already addressed this before. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But notice the caveat here, but only if he loves the Lord. But then Paul makes a comment and he says, and I love that he says this is opinion, but he says, in my opinion, it would be better for her to stay single. And I think I'm giving you counsel from God's Spirit when I say this. Now, it's not a sin if a person's spouse dies and they get remarried. And let me just speak to those of you who have lost a spouse. I cannot stand up here and to pretend that I know in any form or fashion what you feel like at all. I know that there are individuals in this room that you're married for decades, 40, 50, 60 years. One day your spouse is there, the next day they're not. I have no idea what that feels like. But I can imagine that having shared a life with somebody that you loved through the ups and the downs, that it simply just leaves this void. And I'm certain that it's not easy to work through. Having woken up every single day to this person, and then just like that, even if they were sick for a couple months or a couple years and they passed away, I just can't imagine what it would be like to have somebody that you share life with and then they're not there. And I think that as a church, we should also be careful, as we should be careful what we say to people that are single, we should be careful how we address widows. You know, when somebody, I know a lot of people struggle, you know, when somebody dies, we all struggle on what to say. There's really nothing you can say. And nobody really gets over death. So if you say, hey, you know, time will heal all wounds, well, that's not true. I don't think anybody ever gets over death. But I think over time, there's more coping. How to live life without a person that you truly, truly loved. And if you're a widow in here, most people don't understand that. But Paul does say that and I think this would be probably, not necessarily, Jeff, I know I'm calling you out a lot, but there's an individual that we know that his 3 spouses have died. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? And he keeps getting remarried. And he's an amazing guy, just an absolutely amazing guy. And I think he's well into his 80s now. But he just has a heart to share life with somebody. And I would say that, like, if there's that heart, if there's that pulling in you, and you're a widow to share life with somebody again, that option's not off the table. But Paul also says, as you're free to do what you want, if you're a widow, He says that it'd be better for her to stay single. I wish there was a little bit more explanation about why this was the case, but not all the blanks are filled in there. I know we've talked a lot about a lot of things today, some of them very complicated. Some of them, it's not, hey, Tom, were you jumping up and down to talk about that? Not really. I do like to see you guys sweat a little bit. But God has given us relationships. Whether that be a marriage relationship or if you choose to remain single, typically God will surround you with people that fulfill the needs that you have being single. And these relationships are things that we should cherish. And I'm not sure why this is. If it's just me, then maybe this is just therapy time for me. But I'm always amazed how we take for granted the very people that live in our homes. A lot of times we can walk into a workplace and we can give the people there our very best. And when we get home, we drop our guard and we treat people that we should love the most, the worst. And I think sometimes it has to do with the fact that we just believe that they'll love us no matter what. And they probably will. But can I encourage you that if you are married right now, especially if you're struggling through your marriage, maybe it is seasonal, but maybe it's been just an ongoing with no break. Instead of sweeping things under the carpet, the only way that you will begin to heal in your marriage is to do something super complicated, and it's this. Talk. Is that easy? No, honestly. But if you love this person and they love you, and there's a struggle in your heart, it's possible that maybe that person doesn't know you're even having a struggle in the relationship, or potentially they don't even know how deep it is. Now, I know a lot of times women get this bad reputation for, oh, you should just know what's wrong with me type thing. But maybe we don't. And maybe vice versa. The marriage relationship should be something that is cherished through the good times and the bad. So can I challenge you, if you're married, and we'll get to this several weeks down the road, but Paul fleshes out what love in a relationship looks like. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. And then I love this. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Is this something that you can do humanly? Nope. We can't love in this way humanly. But when we, for those who are married, when you wake up every day and you ask God, God, give me the love that you've promised through the Spirit. I can't love in the way that I should. I can't love my wife in the way that I should. But that's with the Spirit as I surrender control to him. God, help me to be patient today. Help me to be kind. Help me not to be irritable or rude. God, help me to endure all things. God, help me not to insist on my own way. God, help me not to be envious or boastful or arrogant. And this isn't in there, but this is the Tom translation. Help me to just hang on when things aren't going the way that they should be. Help me to trust that you can help us work through this.